Welcome to the Masterclass in Implementing the TCFD Recommendations. Today's webinar will be presented by the authors of the TCFD Implementation Guide. And during this webinar, you will learn how to prepare for effective TCFD-aligned disclosures and understand what good practice could look like in mock disclosures using the CDSB framework and the SASB standards. My name is Gemma Clements, and I will be facilitating today. We are also very keen for you to receive feedback on the guide, so do please email us with any comments or feedback after the webinar. Now, let me present to you the authors of the guide. Nadine Robinson is the Technical Director at CDSB, where she leads and delivers CDSB's International Technical Work Programme and focuses on activities relating to climate and environmental disclosures, the TCFD, and making corporate reporting fit for purpose. David Pyham is Director of Research Projects at SASB, where he is responsible for developing and managing the research team's strategic plan, establishing and overseeing research projects and practice areas, and managing internal interfaces between the research team and other departments. So with that, Nadine, I will pass over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Just wanted to start by saying a little bit about CDSB. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board is a consortium of 9 environmental and business NGOs. And we were set up in Davos at the World Economic Forum in 2007 with our mission of creating the enabling conditions for material climate change and natural capital information to be integrated into the mainstream report. And we achieve this by offering a framework for environmental and climate information. So that's a little bit about CDSB. And if I could just hand over to David now, who would like to introduce SASB.
Great, thank you, Nadine. So as Nadine mentioned, the TCFD has issued 2 status reports so far, and about 2 weeks ago issued their 2019 status report, reviewing the current state of disclosure on climate-related matters and the alignment with the TCFD's recommended disclosures. And so just some of the high-level takeaways from the status report. You can see that there is a great level of support that was from organizations to support the TCFD's recommendations, with 785 organizations responsible for well over $100 trillion of assets having expressed their support for the TCFD and its recommended disclosures. However, despite the support, the status report tells us that despite this rising support, companies are still finding it challenging to implement the recommendations, which has resulted in really an insufficient level of disclosure and information to investors. So to break that down, they had 4 real findings that they summarized that emerged from their status report, and this was based on the TCFD's review of reports from over 1,000 large companies, as well as a survey that they conducted on company efforts to implement the TCFD's recommendations, as well as the users of that information's views on the usefulness of climate-related financial disclosures for decision-making. So to briefly touch on each of those 4 takeaways to help set the stage for what we view as hopefully being a helpful tool in the implementation guide. One of the first takeaways that they highlighted was that disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased since 2016, but is still at an insufficient level for investors. And in their survey, as well as in their review of current disclosure, the task force really identified that there's progress being made to improve the availability and quality of climate-related financial information, but it's really not keeping pace with the speed at which changes are needed to limit the rise in global average temperature. And so really identifying that need for more rapid uptake and especially disclosure of the information needed by investors to be able to account for climate-related risk in their decision-making. The second takeaway was that more clarity is needed on the potential financial impact of climate-related issues on companies. And this was the top area that was identified by the users of climate-related financial disclosures as really needing improvement, and for companies to be able to provide more clarity on the potential financial impacts of climate-related issues on their business. again, to support their ability to make informed financial decisions. And we really hope that the guide that we've produced helps highlight how our frameworks, both the CDSB framework and the SASB standards, can really be useful tools to add clarity specifically around this element of tying performance and exposure to climate-related risk through to financial impacts. The third piece, for companies that are using scenarios, the majority did not disclose information on the resilience of their strategies. And I think the TCFD cited that 3 out of 5 companies that responded to the survey that use scenario analysis do not disclose information on the resilience of their strategies. I think this is just an important gap that they've identified that many of us are familiar with around scenario analysis, and that this is a process as companies evolve their approaches, but certainly more work to be done here to support companies in learning how they can integrate scenario analysis into their corporate strategy formulation process. And then the last takeaway was around the mainstreaming of climate-related issues and how this really requires the involvement of multiple functions within reporting organizations. And again, in their survey, they found certainly sustainability and corporate responsibility functions are the primary drivers of TCFD implementation, but that risk management, finance, and executive management are increasingly involved as well. And the involvement of multiple functions is really critical to mainstreaming climate-related issues, especially around the risk management and finance functions. And again, we hope the guide is a helpful platform to enable these sorts of conversations to occur within companies by providing examples of disclosure and pointing to how the SASB and the CDSB frameworks can work together to facilitate strong disclosure based on the recommendations of the TCFD. And so with that framing, I'll pass it back to Nadine to introduce the guide and help position how it can be helpful, we hope, in continuing to further the work of the TCFD.
Thank you, David. So this sort of leads us nicely into our next question, which is how can we accelerate adoption of the recommendations to facilitate consistent, comparable, and clear climate-related financial disclosures? So that's where we felt the implementation guide can help to bridge this gap from taking the commitment to the TCFD into concerted action and disclosures. So through our research, we spoke with many companies who cited the need for practical advice and guidance on how to implement the TCFD recommendations. Basically, everyone has been saying they're really hungry for good examples of good practice disclosure that companies can follow. So we developed the guide with this in mind, and we wanted to showcase how companies can enhance climate-related financial disclosures using both the SASB and CDSB frameworks. And I'll just hand over to David now, who's going to step through the structure of the guide. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nadine. So really, as you can see here, there's kind of 3 main elements to the guide that I'll walk through briefly. The first in the Getting Started section is really to identify those actions that are required to establish a strong foundation to enable reporters to practically and effectively implement the 11 different TCFD recommended financial disclosures. So this is all concentrated in that Getting Started section, which helps reporting organizations to lay the groundwork and build on their existing processes and structures, for example, around risk and governance, to be prepared and ready to make these disclosures. So with that in place, the next section of the guide moves on to providing industry-specific and annotated examples showing what those disclosures could look like. So really showing rather than telling what effective disclosure could look like and pointing to how SASB and CDSB can be helpful tools to create that effective disclosure. And then lastly, providing some practical how-to guidance an organization can use to develop or refine its own practices. And this is helpful to, as companies or as reporting entities look forward to continuing to improve their disclosure over the long term. So in preparing the guide, the CDSB and SASB have captured several lessons learned for corporate practitioners, and these are included in the key takeaways section. We'll chat about a few of them as well at the end of this presentation. And with that, I'll hand it back to Nadine, who's going to walk us through in more detail some of the sections of the guide that I've just provided an overview for.
Thank you, David. So the getting started section of the guide is really about getting your house in order and making the TCFD work for you. So we've identified 11 things to start with. So it's really not just about disclosure, but laying the groundwork or foundation upon which to develop effective disclosures. And so David has already touched on both in setting out the structure of the guide and also in some of the findings of the status report. Some of the key elements that we think are necessary to get started. So we begin with the first step of securing board support. So leadership sets the tone at the top to establish key climate-related factors as core business drivers. These should be identified, assessed, managed, and reported like any other business critical issue. And that's a theme, one of the 4 themes that was highlighted from this TCFD status report. You'll see throughout the remaining steps that they're all about, again, integrating climate into routine business activities. So this can entail looking at your existing priorities, practice, policies, and processes to see where they need to be established or refined in this respect. So some of the other steps about getting started include assessing your business against at least 2 scenarios, or soliciting feedback from engaged investors to understand what information they need related to climate-related risk, financial risks and opportunities. So as I said, these are what we consider as the necessary preconditions for good TCFD disclosure. So now let's turn back to the disclosures themselves.
Great. Thank you, Nadine. So on this next slide, you can see that the core of the guide is really focusing on these real-world illustrations from specific sectors through mock disclosures. So in the guide, we provide mock disclosures for 3 different sectors, but really the analytical approach and the manner in which we've presented those mock disclosures is intended to show how the principle-based approach and the use of the SASB standards and CDSB framework can apply no matter what industry you're in. So for the guide, we focused on mock disclosures for 3 different industries, for a fictional oil and gas company, creatively named OilCo, which is an integrated oil and gas company with global operations, an automobile manufacturer, AutoCo, which is a global manufacturer of passenger vehicles, light trucks, and motorcycles, as well as a company in the agricultural products industry, with Agrico being engaged in processing, trading, and distributing vegetables and fruits and producing and milling agricultural commodities. So as you can see here, across each of the 4 industry examples, we've covered all 4 of the major TCFD recommended disclosure areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And we included each section, so for the OilCo example, we included each section, which really enables users of the guide to observe the importance of the connectivity of information across the 4 disclosure sections, and then additionally provided other industry examples for certain sections to further illustrate the ways in which companies or reporting entities can make use of the TCFD recommended disclosures, as well as the CDSB framework and the SASB standards to support and enhance their reporting efforts. So in the subsequent slides, we'll take you through a couple examples of these mock disclosure examples and how you can use both the CDSB framework and the SASB standards to decide what and how to disclose this information in your mainstream report. In the paper, as I alluded to earlier, we do this by providing examples of disclosures and then have narrative that accompanies those disclosures in the column next to the mock disclosure to help a user of the guide understand how the fictional company in the guide has addressed the respective disclosure in their report. So to really bring this to life, we'll step through a couple of examples in the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Nadine to take us through the first example.
Thank you, David. So let's start with the mock disclosure from OilCo for TCFD's core element on governance. So the governance disclosure A relates to board oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. And at the top of this slide, you'll see a question which is drawn from the guidance on board oversight disclosures in the TCFD final report. So this helps to identify the possible content for the disclosure, in this case, processes and frequency by which the board are informed of climate-related issues. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you will see an excerpt from the disclosure which has two numbers flagging where the disclosure has satisfied the first disclosure requirement in the CDSB reporting framework. On the right-hand side, we listed a specific disclosure requirement under the CDSB framework, and this example is drawn from page 18 of our implementation guide. So requirement 1 of the CDSB framework requires that disclosures must describe how environmental policies, strategies, and information are governed. And this also includes those related to climate. So mirroring the TCFD recommendation, requirement 1 suggests preparers consider how the highest governing body approaches and it is informed of climate-related issues. In the OilCo excerpt on the left-hand side of your screen, the highest governing body and the company responsible for climate-related policies, strategies, and information appears to be the board, as shown in the annotation 1. However, they also have an integrated sustainability and advisory committee, which informs the board of climate-related impacts and is charged with reviewing actual or potential climate-related risks and reporting back to the board with recommendations. So we flag this as well. So now if I turn to David to give a further example drawn from the strategy core element of the TCFD.
Great, thank you, Nadine. So in this next example, we're going to again look at an example from our fictional oil and gas company, OilCo, and specifically look at their mock disclosure related to the TCFD's recommended disclosure element, the strategy element C, which is around the resilience of the company's strategy under a 2-degree or lower scenario. And so this excerpt really will allow us to step through and identify how the CDSB framework and SASB standards work together to enable OilCo to robustly meet this recommended disclosure. And as we'll see in a moment, the OilCo example includes the identification of several scenarios that were used, as well as the use of metrics to communicate in a comparable way the impacts of those scenarios and how that relates to the resilience of OilCo's forward strategy. So I'll first hand it back to Nadine, who will walk us through how the CDSB framework supports this disclosure, and then I'll go through how the SASB standard similarly supports meeting this TCFD recommended disclosure. So Nadine, back to you.
Thank you, David. So again, on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that we signpost what the CDSB requirement is to be applied. So requirement 3 of the CDSB framework relates to risks and opportunities, and it's about disclosing current and future environmental and climate risks affecting the organization and their management. So requirement 3 also advises that all organizations reporting consider applying a basic level of scenario analysis for strategic planning and risk management processes, and that they should describe the scenarios used. So as an oil and gas company, OilCo is likely to be more significantly affected by climate-related risks, and therefore has taken a somewhat more in-depth approach per the TCFD recommendations. So the company identifies 5 scenarios, including 3 widely used third-party scenarios. So the current policy scenarios, the new policy scenario, and the sustainable development scenario. And these are marked in the disclosure on your screen with the annotation 1. And interestingly, OilCo has also included 2 internally developed additional scenarios to help them in the context of the transition risks that they face. So this relates to rapid electrification scenario and also a decarbonization scenario. And now if I turned back to David, hand it back over to David to describe how the SASB standards can be applied to the same disclosure.
Perfect. Thank you, Nadine. So based on that robust discussion that Nadine just outlined that OilCo has provided regarding how it integrates scenario analysis into its strategic planning process, the SASB standard provides a related topic in the oil and gas standard, which is the reserves valuation and capital expenditures topic, and an associated metric which provides specific and detailed guidance on how such a sensitivity analysis can be performed. And as Nadine mentioned, the SASB standard leverages common reference scenarios provided by the International Energy Agency, as well as providing the company with the opportunity to disclose additional scenarios that the company feels are useful tools to stress test the resilience of its forward strategy. So in terms of the disclosures made by the company, OilCo here has reported the resiliency of its oil and gas reserves, both proved and probable reserves, and how those are impacted both by the multiple International Energy Agency scenarios, as well as its own scenarios that it has identified as being particularly useful and informative to stress testing the resilience of its forward strategy. And those are those additional scenarios that Nadine mentioned, which include a rapid electrification of the transportation infrastructure, as well as a rapid decarbonization of the global economy. So what's interesting about this is elsewhere in the report, you'll learn how OilCo has leveraged these scenarios and the resulting impacts to its reserve base to establish key signposts that will inform OilCo as to the health of its strategy, which it has described elsewhere in the report as increasingly shifting its capital allocation away from oil towards natural gas. And the health of that strategy in delivering its expected risk mitigative effects, or whether OilCo may need to take more radical steps to shift towards lower carbon or renewable energy sources, which are signposted by the more aggressive rapid electrification or rapid decarbonization scenarios that OilCo has identified. So as a result, one can observe how the CDSB framework, as well as the SASB standards, has enabled OilCo in this example to make clear, comparable, and useful disclosures that are well aligned and supported and meet the requirements of the TCFD recommended disclosure related to strategy element C. And with that, I'll pass it back to Nadine, who will talk us through some of the really interesting takeaways that we discovered throughout preparing this guide that we think may be useful to companies seeking to make these disclosures utilizing the guide. So back to you, Nadine.
Thank you, David. We had a real appreciation of what was required in terms of the analytical thinking and process to develop the disclosures. And this is sort of where these key takeaways came from. So as we come towards the end of this masterclass, and before we turn to some Q&A, we wanted to highlight 5 key points or takeaways that we found particularly useful in writing the implementation guide. So the first one relates to where to start and where to begin. And we would suggest always starting with defining the objectives you want to achieve through your reporting. And this applies in all cases of reporting, whether it be on climate-related risks or other forms of reporting. And so we have developed the questions from the TCFD guidance to help you as a prompt for each of the recommended disclosures. So as we say, we start with at the beginning with the objectives. So what do you want to achieve? The next thing we suggest is basically keeping it simple, and this is your opportunity really to tell your story about how you are managing your climate-related risks and opportunities. So you can use the TCFD principles to help you make your disclosures. So we suggest you approach it one recommendation at a time and then to build on them. And we know that as reporting practice will evolve over time, we expect to see more streamlined disclosures. So the third point relates around connectivity of information. And we suggest considering, after you've kind of taken a sequential approach to developing your disclosures, to consider how the disclosures are connected to other information in the mainstream report. So this is about tying it back to tell your coherent story, and it's mutually reinforcing. So if we take an example, the strategy disclosures tell you how you have elected to respond to climate-related risks and opportunities, and the metrics and targets tell you how you're performing against your strategy. The fourth point is what we call the push for proportionality. And we really think it's important to be proportionate in your climate-related disclosures. And we think that applying materiality as a concept can help, particularly for the strategy and metrics and targets TCFD disclosures. In that respect, in terms of proportionality, we've also seen that tools like dashboards or conformance tables are also useful to sort of provide an overview of climate-related financial disclosures. Finally, we suggest taking an iterative approach to scenario analysis in keeping with the task force acknowledgement in the TCFD final report that there's going to be learning by doing on scenarios. So we suggest establishing a reasonable baseline for scenario analysis that can be built upon. So you can begin, for example, with a specific asset or aspect of the business and then expand upon it. So those are kind of 5 key takeaways that we felt were useful to convey. Now, we also have identified a number of different resources to support you in TCFD implementation, and I'll just hand over to David to step you through those.
Great, thank you, Nadine. So in addition to the TCFD implementation guide, which is the subject of today's webinar, I wanted to highlight a few additional resources that may be helpful to folks who are looking for useful tools to help them get started or if they've already made disclosures to continue to enhance and improve the quality of their TCFD-aligned disclosures. So first and foremost, we really encourage folks to check out the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which is at www.tcfdhub.org, which provides just a fantastic and comprehensive database of resources to help understand and implement the TCFD recommendations. In the top left, you saw in an earlier slide the checklist that was included in the paper that provides a helpful getting started guide for companies and evaluating disclosure readiness. So really, as a first step, would encourage folks to take a look at those first steps of that getting started element of the guide to assess their disclosure readiness. In the bottom left, there would point folks to a really helpful and focused paper that was prepared by the CDSB and the Center for ESG Research, which developed a short, very focused guide on conducting scenario analysis and providing associated disclosures that help meet investor needs. And then finally, in the bottom right, SASB and the CDSB previously collaborated on a paper called Converging on Climate Risk that really shows how our frameworks are conceptually aligned with the TCFD. And then the current guide is really the more practical guidance for practitioners implementing the TCFD's recommendations to help them get started and really practically and tangibly understand how our two frameworks work together to enable corporate practitioners to start making TCFD-aligned disclosure. And with that, I'll pass it back to Nadine to briefly talk about opportunities to provide us with feedback on the guide, and then I think we'll be ready to take questions from the audience.
Great, thank you for that useful overview, David. So just to let you know that we'd love to hear what you think of the guide, and we have developed a short survey available on the CDSB website. So www.cdsb.net, you'll see it. It's in one of our news items right at the top right-hand corner, and we'd welcome your feedback on the guide and also where you feel additional guidance is needed. So we encourage you to share your thoughts, and we would like to take them on board as we develop further capacity building and training materials and technical materials collaboratively. So now if we just go to if we go to the next slide. It's sort of now an opportunity for, we're receiving a number of questions through the chat function. So I'll just hand over to Gemma to pull a couple of the questions coming through on the chat function for us to respond to.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you, David. I think all of the information that you provided has been super helpful, and I can see from the chat that we've got a lot of great questions coming in. Just to let everybody know that these slides will be available after the webinar. We will email everybody with the slides and the recording, so we are also recording. But I'm going to dive straight in to some of these questions. So firstly, traditional financial reporting is usually historical, but when we're talking about climate-related disclosures and issues, we're often talking about forward-looking information. So do you have any advice about how companies could integrate forward-looking disclosures into the traditional reporting framework?
Nadine, do you want to take a first pass at that one?
I think that really the forward-looking disclosures can be done in the context of looking at the mapping out the risks and opportunities related to climate-related. Mapping out climate-related risks and opportunities through the scenario analysis, and they can be included in your narrative.
Yeah, and I would echo that in that really the indicators that are included in the SASB standards are intended to help provide a view of the company's current performance, but as well as support the other sections of the report that are intended to be more forward-looking. So discussing the data that describes the current performance of the company on these key climate-related issues, but also contextualizing that within the company's forward-looking strategy, as well as its process to manage risks that it expects to emerge over the short, medium, and long-term horizons, which are part of the TCFD recommended disclosures. So I think that's how we sort of think about using the SASB standards in that context.
Fantastic. Another question that's come in has asked, so there are 4 core elements of the TCFD, and as we saw from the TCFD status report, there's different levels of maturity when it comes to disclosing against them. So are there any elements of the TCFD that are lagging behind in disclosure, and any of them that are particularly good?
Thanks, Gemma. Shall I start? I think that David had mentioned at the very beginning that the disclosures on strategy C, on how resilient is your organizational strategy, business model, etc., to a changing climate and the different climate scenarios, is an area of reporting where we haven't seen the level of maturity of disclosures, and that's something that that was recognized in the final report of the TCFD and in the most recent status report. But we have seen some examples where that is some good examples. And if you look at Unilever's 2018 annual report, you find that they make the strategy C disclosure. So they outline the they provide an indication of the assumptions that they've had to their scenarios. They look at 2 scenarios, a 2-degree and a 4-degree scenario, and they look at the impacts on their business. And then interestingly, they make make a conclusion on the fact that they don't need to change their business substantially in light of the conclusions that they've made on the scenario analysis. So they've taken that fourth, so that final step in the strategy resilience TCFD scenario, which others haven't. But I think we're going to start to see a lot more disclosures. So we know that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes that may not necessarily be making it into the disclosures this year or last year, but we can anticipate to see in the future.
And I think I'll just add another area, and this was highlighted in the 2019 status report that seemed to be lagging a bit, is in general the disclosures around risk management, and especially the recommended disclosure C related to risk management around the integration of the integration of climate-related matters into overall risk management. According to the status report, that was an area that was quite lacking in their survey of existing corporate reporting as well. And I think that's interestingly consistent with some of our findings as we did this guide, and that certainly the elements around risk management and really thinking through how to integrate climate-related matters into your overall risk management process is certainly a challenging task, but one that we hope some of the examples that we've provided can help companies think through different models that the fictional companies have taken in terms of meeting that recommended disclosure element.
Thank you. We have a few questions that are quite similar, so I'm going to kind of draw a couple of these questions together, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them for everybody. So we saw quite early on in the presentation that there are a lot of organisations that are supporting the TCFD. Do we know what sectors are leading or which sectors are lagging, and perhaps some of the challenges that different sectors are facing?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first, and then Nadine would welcome your thoughts as well. So pointing to really what the TCFD has found, they found that the industry that was generally leading in terms of overall disclosure was the banking industry, with some of the highest disclosure rates that they identified in their status report. which I think is unsurprising given the importance of this information to that industry in terms of the overall objectives of the TCFD. I think it's really interesting to take a look at and dive into some of the findings in that status report, because there are some interesting takeaways around the concentration of certain industries tend to disclose certain aspects of the recommendations more. So, for example, the energy sub-industry group that's part of the more climate-exposed groups that the TCFD identified showed relatively high disclosure around especially the strategy section, but lower disclosure, for example, in the risk management section, whereas the materials and buildings group showed relatively high disclosure around climate-related metrics, but lower, for example, in the governance section. So some really interesting takeaways there in terms of the variability and sort of unevenness of disclosure across the different industries. And again, somewhere where we hope the guide can be helpful in meeting specific challenges in different industries where reporting practitioners are running up against some challenges in meeting the full TCFD recommended disclosures, for which we hope providing disclosure examples for each section can help bridge some of those gaps, or at least provide a helpful or useful viewpoint. Nadine, did you have any other insights or comments on that?
I think that's it. That's a useful overview.
Great.
Fantastic. Now, this guide is really super helpful because it really demonstrates how you can use the SASB standards and the CDSB framework in order to implement the TCFD. But there are other frameworks and other standards out there. So the question is, has there been any work so far trying to connect the TCFD to these other frameworks and standards?
Yeah, maybe I can, or Nadine, do you want to start off there? And then maybe I can jump in as well.
Sure. So I think, thanks, Gemma and David. I think that this is a really good example of where you can have different standards and frameworks that come together that can be complementary and support effective TCFD disclosures. So David and I also sit on the technical team, which is part of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue's Better Alignment project. And over the past year, we have been looking specifically at the TCFD and through the lens of climate, and looking at how our different frameworks and standards, so how the SASB standards and the CDSB framework, as well as those of the other project participants, which include IIRC, CDP, and GRI, to see how we all align together. And so we've undertaken a mapping not only on alignment across the 7 effective principles for disclosure, but we've also looked at our alignment to the 11 recommended disclosures, and then specifically we have undertaking mapping, which is just being in the final stages of being written up, on the different sample indicators in the TCFD to see how we're aligned between them. And we will be launching or releasing our report of our findings on this exercise, as well as the round tables that we've held globally, and an online survey to sort of really give a picture of what are the opportunities for our alignment on how do we align on TCFD, and then what are the opportunities for wider alignment on ESG issues. So how do we all fit together, and what's the interconnection? And that is done from the 5 organizations I mentioned. But so we look forward to launching that report in September. David, would you like to add anything on the Better Alignment project?
That's perfect. Yeah, that's I think speaks directly to the question, and having had the benefit along with Nadine to be involved in the technical work, one of the key areas that Nadine touched on is really it was a really fantastic thing to be able to dive in with the other frameworks and really understand where information reported to one framework can be similarly reported to other frameworks. And so part of the indicators mapping that Nadine mentioned was really focused on assessing that within the context of the TCFD's recommended disclosures and the illustrative example metrics So part of the final report out will include some summary of that work to help practitioners understand where we align on different indicators so that data can be used to meet reporting requirements under multiple frameworks.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a few more questions, and there's loads still coming in. So, Nadine, you mentioned Unilever in a previous response. Are there any other examples of good practice that you could let the audience know about?
Maybe I can start off real quick with one example, and then would very much welcome Nadine's suggestions as well. But one report that came out not too long ago that I think really resonated with the topic that we were discussing today, which is really about integrating the information from our frameworks, CDSB and SASB, into a TCFD report. I would point to the most recent JetBlue report, in which they produced a standalone SASB and TCFD report, in which they really brought together the two frameworks and leveraged the SASB standards as part of their overall TCFD-aligned disclosure, and really provide robust and comprehensive, I would say, disclosure around the different TCFD elements, and then bring in, where it is helpful, specific metrics from the SASB standard to help communicate performance. So I think that's an interesting example for folks who are looking for real world examples of how different companies are approaching the TCFD, and certainly would encourage folks to take a look at that. And then Nadine, over to you if you had any additional examples you wanted to highlight.
Sure. Thank you, David. So I think one, I alluded to this a little bit earlier in our talk about where's a good place to get started is we've seen a number of organizations actually making disclosures in the form of reference tables, or we call them dashboards. And if you wanted an example of one, you could look at Total's registration document for 2018, which includes a reference table. So it outlines the different core elements of the TCFD, the thematic areas, and then it lists the 11 recommended disclosures. And then it actually signposts specifically where that information can be found in Total's existing reporting. So it refers to the relevant paragraphs of its registration documents, it refers to its own climate risk report, and it also refers to where the answers can be found in the CDP questionnaire. So I think that's a really good first step, a useful one. The other example that I just wanted to draw on was we haven't seen as many reports and as many disclosures related to the opportunities side of climate-related risks and opportunities. And I think the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, in its annual report for 2018, is an example of how they have looked at the opportunities related to the low-carbon transition, and they've actually quantified this. So that's a good example to look. The other thing that's particularly interesting and kind of relates to what I said on the Total example is that the Commonwealth Bank of Australia's report identifies sort of its phased approach to TCFD implementation. So it says we're not necessarily going to do everything in each financial year, but it outlines what it's going to do. So in phase one, it's going to focus on policy, due diligence, and governance. And in that respect, they have developed a climate policy position statement, an environmental policy, etc. And then in phase two, it's going to move into analysis of its portfolio risks and opportunities. And finally, it is going to extend scenario analysis in phase three, and so I thought that's an interesting approach as well.
Fantastic. I think we have time for maybe two more questions. The first one would be, what do you think the greatest challenge has been for companies who are either starting the TCFD or who are trying to make good disclosure?
Good question.
Shall I start on the greatest challenge? I think it's two things. It's knowing where to start, and it's also trying to identify what good practice looks like. And one of the things that we didn't say at the beginning is that we specifically developed the mock disclosures in the implementation guide to identify what we think at this current stage in year 2 of TCFD disclosures looks like, so that those that are starting can actually can look at some tangible examples and understand the narrative behind it, how it fits, so that they can identify where to get started. So I think the big challenge is identifying good practice, and in that respect, SASB and CDSB will be producing a short publication in the autumn, which is going to highlight some of the good practices to date on TCFD implementation globally. So we hope that will help as well as a complementary resource to the implementation guide.
Great. And the only new addition that I would make to that is I think one of the things that we found once you've gotten past that initial hurdle and you're into developing your disclosures were a couple of the things that Nadine focused on in the takeaways, but really the challenge in trying to keep the reporting very concise and very focused on what investors need to understand the company's management of exposure to and management of these risks. And related to that, ensuring that the information remains connected across the 4 different disclosure elements, so that an investor reading through the 4 disclosure elements can really comprehensively understand how the company is managing climate-related risks and opportunities, and how the 4 elements really work together as part of a robust strategy for managing and mitigating climate risk. So in the report, we talk in a little bit more depth about what we mean by that and point to how the guide can be helpful in enabling that connectivity of information across the 4 sections through leveraging the CDSB and SASB frameworks.
Fantastic. And we have just a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask you a really quick question to both of you. What would be your one top tip, your one piece of advice for companies?
Shall I start, David? I think my top tip is really don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That recognize that your disclosures are going to evolve over time. So it's really important to get started with them.
Absolutely, that's what I was. That's exactly what I was going to say, and really to leverage tools and resources that are available to you to help you get started, and hopefully the guide is one of those. Certainly, looking to examples of robust disclosure is helpful as well, and then would encourage folks to continue to let us know, as Nadine alluded to earlier, how we can continue to be helpful in this journey towards enhanced climate-related disclosure.
And I think that's a perfect place for us to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you so much to David and Nadine for giving us your time and your expertise. Thank you all for all your questions. I know that we weren't able to get through all of them, but do email us with any thoughts or any feedback about the guide. We'd massively appreciate that. And we will be circulating, as I said before, the recording and the presentation with you after the webinar. So thank you all again, and have a great day.